I'm David Binns, and tonight's video Bible study is on the Sabbath and how Christians are to view it. Let me begin by reading you a command that God gave to his people in the Old Testament. He said, "Observe the Sabbath and keep it holy, as I, the Lord your God, have commanded you. You have 6 days in which to do your work, but the 7th day is a day of rest, dedicated to me. On that day no one is to work, neither you, your children, your slaves, your animals, nor the foreigners who live in your country. Your slaves must rest just as you do. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that I, the Lord your God, rescued you by my great power and strength. That is why I command you to observe the Sabbath." Now, back in those days, the people of Israel knew when the Sabbath day was. Things were different on that day. They didn't just have God's command to remind them when the Sabbath day came. They had a miracle every Sabbath day when they were out in the desert to tell them when it was the Sabbath day. You can read of this in Exodus chapter 16. When God rescued his people from slavery in Egypt, they crossed over the Red Sea and they began travelling into the Sinai desert. They were out in the desert only a couple of months when they started grumbling and complaining to Moses. They said, "Would have been better for us to die back there in Egypt, where we had plenty of food and bread, rather than come out here and die in the desert as God's people, because we're going to die out here." And it was in response to that complaint of God's people that God promised to send them both food, bread in the morning, and meat in the evening. The bread, he said, would come down from heaven as a kind of dew that could be collected every morning. They were told to collect enough of this dew. It sort of came down as dew, and it was on the ground. They could pick it up and they could take it home and bake it and make it into little cakes. They were told to collect enough of this each day for that day. If they collected too much, they couldn't keep it overnight, because if they did, it would go bad. Now, some of them didn't believe what God said through Moses, and they tried to keep some of the bread that they collected on that day over to the next day. And when they got up the next day to see the bread, it had gone bad and it stunk. However, God said that on the 6th day, they were to collect double the amount. That's 4 litres for every person in their family, so that they could keep some for the 7th day, because on the 7th day there wouldn't be any bread. Now, the people did this. They collected on the 6th day twice as much. They ate what they wanted on the 6th day, and they kept some for the Sabbath, the 7th day of rest. And when they kept that on the 7th day, it didn't go bad. It was there for them to eat. And this happened. It kept on happening for the whole 40 years that they were wandering around the desert. God provided his people like this for the 40 years. There was bread for 6 days, and on the 7th day there wasn't any. They weren't allowed to collect for 2 days, except on Friday night. If they did, then it went bad. Now, this reminded the people how important it was for them to observe the Sabbath day and to keep it as a special day, to remember God's work of saving them, how he had saved them by his mighty power out of Egypt. Yet it was also to be a day of rest, the Sabbath day, which means day of rest. When I was a teenager, 40 years ago, Sunday was a very different sort of day to how we have Sunday in our society today. In those days, there were very few shops open, hardly any shops open, not even the local deli. The service stations were all shut. No pubs were allowed to sell alcohol on Sunday, unless you were a bona fide traveller. That means if you were booked in for the pub overnight, they'd give you a drink at the bar. That's the only way you could get it. There was, on Sunday, no organised sporting events where you had to pay to go in. There was some social amateur sport, but that was all. My dad, for example, had to make sure that he had enough petrol in his car before lunchtime on Saturday to get him through the weekend. There was no chance of getting petrol over the weekend. When I became a Christian about 30 years ago, some of my sporting heroes were the Christians who refused to play organised sport on Sunday just purely because they were Christians. I think it was Brian Booth, a Test cricketer for Australia, who refused to play in a Test match in England because they were going to play on a Sunday. And these were some of the people that I used to look up to. I remember also there was a Sturt footballer, he became the captain, I've forgotten his name, who also refused to play when they started to play on Sunday. Now, things have changed a lot since those days. Today, shops are open, you can buy petrol and you can buy most other things on Sunday. In fact, some of the most important sporting activities of the year are played on Sunday. The Crows have just beaten North Melbourne on a Sunday. The Grand Prix is raced on a Sunday. You can drink at a lot of pubs. You can go and gamble at the casino, all on a Sunday. Where, then, do we Christians stand about this fourth commandment, the commandment that says to us, observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy? Remember, Jesus said very clearly that he didn't come to destroy the old law, but to fulfill it. What was Jesus' attitude then to the Sabbath? Now, this is one area where Jesus often clashed with the religious people of his day. On one Sabbath day, he and his disciples were walking through the wheat fields, or the cornfields. The disciples, we read, were hungry, and they picked some of the wheat, and they rubbed them in their hands to get the grain out, and they started eating the grain, like you might have done if you'd been in the country and picked up a few grains of some wheat that was ripe. Now, some of the Pharisees who were with Jesus at the time said, look here, it's against our law for your disciples to do this on the Sabbath day. The act of picking the wheat, of taking the wheat and rubbing it in their hands and taking the grain out, was considered by the religious leaders of that day as being work. It wasn't rest, it was work. And therefore they said that it's against the laws that we've made. Now, Jesus answered the Pharisees like this. He said, first of all, he told them about an incident that they all knew about in the Bible, in the Old Testament. He said that one day King David, when he had to flee from Jerusalem because his rebellious son Absalom had risen against him, ended up in the temple. And he went there with a small band of soldiers, and they were hungry. So we read that David took some of the showbread, the bread that people had offered to God in the temple and had left there as an offering to God. And he took some of this bread and he ate some of it because he was hungry. And he gave some to his soldiers that were with him. But the law said, the old law said, that only the priests were allowed to eat the showbread. And David nor the soldiers weren't priests. And yet David wasn't condemned by God. He was hungry and he ate it. You see, God is much more interested in man's hearts and relieving people's needs than in keeping a lot of religious rules that have been laid down. Now, Jesus said all this happened in the day when Abiathar was the high priest. He then went on and also said to the Pharisees something else about the Sabbath. He said, the Sabbath was made for the good of man. Now, it wasn't the other way round. Man wasn't made just to fit into the Sabbath, but the Sabbath was made for the good of man. God gave the Sabbath for man's benefit, to help us, not to stop us enjoying life or to stop us helping others. Keeping a few rules about, or making a few rules about what you can do and what you can't do on the Sabbath day doesn't do us any good, won't do you any good. It won't help you spiritually. However, observing the Sabbath day as a special day, as a day of relaxation, of a day of resting in God's love, is of great advantage to the Christian. God himself planned for the whole of creation the need for one day in 7 to be a day of rest. We read that he created the universe in 6 days, and on the 7th day even God himself rested, to show the rest of us, to show his creation, that we too are to live like that. The Sabbath was made for the good of man, for your good and for my good, to help us live as his people, to help us be led by the Holy Spirit and have the freedom to let the Spirit of God lead us. And then Jesus went on and said to the Pharisees another reason why his disciples had such freedom on the Sabbath day. The Pharisees wouldn't like what he was going to say, but nevertheless they had to listen to him. He said, "The Son of Man is the Lord even of the Sabbath." Actually, the Son of Man is the Lord of every day, but in particular, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. He was telling them that there was only one person who could tell people what they could do and what they couldn't do on the Sabbath day. And that one person was the Messiah, the one that God had promised would come into the world to be God's king, the Messiah, the Son of Man. He is the Lord of the Sabbath. And of course, we know that Jesus himself is the Son of Man, the Messiah, the one that God promised long before would come into the world and take over David's kingdom. Now this is very important for us today as we do a study on the Sabbath, as we do a Bible study, because if the command to observe the Sabbath means anything, it is Jesus, through his Holy Spirit, who will tell us how we're to observe it. He is the Lord of the Sabbath. It is Jesus who will tell us what we can do and what we can't do on the Sabbath, who will lead us to rest in God on that day. After this confrontation with the religious leaders, with the Pharisees, Jesus then, we read, went back to a synagogue where there was a church service going on, or a Jewish church service. I've just called it a church service. They wouldn't have called it that, a synagogue service. Now, in the congregation, there was a man who had a badly paralysed hand. It was withered. It was useless. Probably just short, withered hand, just hanging there, useless. There was also, in that congregation, some people who were Jesus' enemies. Jesus seemed to have enemies, and those of us that go out and take the good news out to others also find we had enemies. But he had enemies, and they wanted to find some way to accuse him of doing some wrong. So they were watching him closely, we read, to see whether he would heal this man on the Sabbath day or not. They had in the back of their minds that if he healed on the Sabbath day, he'd be doing something wrong, he'd be working. Now Jesus knew what they were thinking, so he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come up here to the front." Could you imagine it? The whole congregation of people in the synagogue, Jesus at the front, doing some teaching, and inviting this man to come forward. In front of everybody, he said to the people, "What does our law allow us to do on the Sabbath day? To help a person or to harm them? To save a person's life or to destroy it?" Surely, he was saying, it's okay to do good on the Sabbath day. Surely it's okay to help this poor person who's got this terrible withered hand on the Sabbath day. But the people, particularly the religious leaders, said nothing. They knew they couldn't argue with Jesus because they probably knew in their minds that they were wrong. But they weren't prepared to change, even to allow this poor man to be healed. And we read that Jesus, when they said nothing, he looked at them and he was angry as he looked around at them. You know, the only people that we read that Jesus was ever angry with in the Scriptures were the religious people who went to church and who thought they were good, who thought that they were worshipping God. But at the same time as getting angry, we read that he felt sorry for them because they were so stubborn and wrong. Then he said to the man with the withered hand, "Stretch out your hand." And when the man obeyed, his hand was healed instantly in front of the people. God's power brought a mighty healing to take place. The withered hand became whole. A miracle took place in the front of their eyes. But we read the Pharisees left the synagogue full of hate, and they joined together with their enemies, the Herodians, the secular people of that day, to make plans together to kill Jesus. These two groups, I suppose it was a bit like the Labour Party and the Liberal Party, both coming together against a common enemy. The Herodians and the Pharisees came together with their hate for Jesus, to plan to kill him. So, what does all this teach us about the Sabbath and how we are to treat the Sabbath? For us, of course, we're thinking of the first day of the week and not the seventh day of the week, the last day of the week, which was the Jewish Sabbath. That is, we're thinking of Sunday and not Saturday. Now, there is a reason for this. If we closely study the Scriptures, the Jewish people met together on the Sabbath day, which was the day God told them met together on the Saturday, the seventh day of the week, to remind them of the way God saved them out of slavery in Egypt by his mighty power and brought them across the Red Sea and set them free. But Christians, the early Christians, once they moved away from Israel, started to meet together on the first day of the week, because that reminds us of our salvation, of how Jesus rose from the dead on the first day of the week. And we find that the early Christians started to meet not just on the seventh day of the week, but they started to meet together on the first day of the week to worship God, to break bread in the Lord's Supper, to take up collections, to give to the poor, and so forth. So when we're thinking of the Sabbath, we're thinking for the Christians usually anyway, of Sunday. It is a day that God has given us as a special day to remember our salvation. Now it's true, as I said before, that every day for the Christian is a special day, is the day that God has made. But he still set aside one day out of 7 that is to be a special, special day, a day set aside for God, a day to particularly remember our salvation, of how God has saved us from sin through the work of Jesus on the cross, through his resurrection and ascension and all that he's done for us. But it is a day of rest, a day when we do something different from the ordinary everyday thing. Now, for those of us that are in Christian ministry, it perhaps becomes the busiest day. And then if it becomes the busiest day, we still know that we need some rest. We might have to make our Sabbath a Monday or a Tuesday or some other day. But for those of us that are just in ordinary occupations, it's a day that we ought to, if we possibly can. It's not a law that we have to keep. It's a day that God's given us, if we can, to treat it differently from every other day of the week. But because it's a day of rest doesn't mean it's a day of sleeping in bed. All right, it may be okay to sleep in a little bit longer on Sunday morning, but it's not a day, resting is not inactivity. It's a matter of resting in God's love, seeking to do those things that God wants us to do. It's a good day for healing to take place. That's why at our church services we like to have a time when people can be ministered to through healing. It's a good day for doing good. There's plenty of good that we can do out there. It's a good day for visiting people in hospital, visiting our friends that we say we haven't got time to visit, visiting elderly folk that are lonely. It's a good day for going and being with some friends and sitting down perhaps around a barbecue or something, and telling them something of the great things God's done for you. Telling them of how, the way of salvation, telling them about Jesus. It's a good day to find a half an hour or so, or perhaps an hour, when you can sit down quietly and pray and read the Scriptures and meditate on the things that God teaches us in the Scriptures. It's a good day just to have a rest as the disciples and Jesus walk through those wheat fields, just relaxing in each other's company. One question that often comes up is the question of the students who are studying every day of the week. People often say, should I study on Sunday? Well, we can't make a rule about whether you should study on Sunday or not. But if you're a student and you're studying 6 days a week, or you're trying to study 7 days a week, I think in the end, even when you're getting near the HSC exams or whatever they are you're doing, your mind gets clogged up if you're studying all the time. You need a day of rest. Why not use the day that God has set aside, or God's people have set aside, as a day when you can have a breakaway from it? Then Monday morning you can go and put your heart back into your study again, and I think you'll find, usually if you're trusting God, that you'll be able to study that much harder. And it's not only students, in every area of our life. We are to observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, but not as a matter of law, but as a matter of grace. The Sabbath day was made for us to enjoy, to help us to live our Christian life, not for us to fit into a lot of rules of things we have to do or things we can't do. May God bless you. Thank you very much.